Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this National Housing Federation webinar. My name is Catherine Ryder. I'm Director of Policy and Research at the NHF. I'm absolutely delighted that so many of you have joined us for today's webinar. My job is to chair this session and make sure we get as much as we can from the time we have together. Over the next hour, we're going to be talking about the new Code of Governance, which was published last week. We're going to hear about how it has changed since the previous 2015 version, why it has changed, and what the main elements of the new code are. We'll also talk through how organisations might consider adopting the new code and why we'd encourage all housing associations to adopt this code specifically designed for our sector. We're joined by Steve and Kerry from Campbell to Curl, who authored the new code, and Fayan Simpson, OBE, who's a board member of L&Q and on our Code of Governance Advisory Group. They're going to offer you their insight, so please take full advantage of their time and ask any questions that you may have. Our speakers will be talking for about 40 minutes, which will leave us plenty of time for questions at the end. I'm not going to give too much away about the new code. I'm going to leave that to Steve and Kerry, but I will say it's the result of a huge amount of engagement with the sector and input from boards, chief executives, governance experts and residents. And we're grateful to all of you, and in particular our advisory group, who challenged and supported the development of the code at every stage. The operating environment we work in has changed hugely over the last 5 years, and the challenges we face in the next 5 years will also be significant. We've tried to make sure the code reflects this environment, but also sets out the requirements that we think will help ensure governance arrangements are robust and fit for the future. And I'm particularly pleased that we're having this conversation the day after the Social Housing White Paper was published, and I'm sure we'll have questions about how our code can help support us in adopting the recommendations in the Social Housing White Paper. I'm sure that Kerry, Steve and Fayan will say more about this, but the issues we've really thought about in our new code are the reputation of the sector, our social purpose, expectations around safety, diversity, equality, inclusion and accountability to residents. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Anna in our digital team and Cam in our events team, who will be helping me in the event of any technical glitches. I have chaired a few webinars now. None have gone wrong so far, so I like to consider myself a good omen, but I'm reassured the team are on hand just in case. If this is your first go-to webinar, here are a few things to look out for in your dashboard. You can close the panel using the red arrow so you can see more of the speakers and the presentations. And if you have any issues with sound, please check the audio tab. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can do this in the question tab in your GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll take questions throughout the session and I'll try and put as many as possible to the panel in our Q&A session at the end. We'll be sending all attendees an email over the next week, which will include a link to the recording of this webinar and the slides from today's session, which you'll be able to download. So that is plenty from me. I'm now going to hand over to Steve, who's going to start talking you through the new code. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm actually now going to start handing over to Kerry, who's going to start this presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. It's really good to be here to talk about the new code. I thought I'd just start by running you through what we're going to cover and a bit perhaps about what we're not. So we thought we'd start by giving you a bit of the background and history to the code, which I hope you'll find interesting. I think it's really helpful to understand how the code sits in the history of the National Housing Federation's codes of governance. So a bit about that and the process we've gone through with the National Housing Federation to arrive at the new code. We'll run you through what's in it, but inevitably in this sort of session we can't talk you through all the detail, and I'm sure you wouldn't particularly enjoy sitting through that already anyway. We're anticipating that you'll have hopefully at least had a chance to skim it and get a sense of what's in it. We're going to focus on talking you through the key principles that structure it and a bit about what's changed and where the new emphasis is in the code and why. So we'll do a bit of that and then obviously a bit of summing up at the end. Next slide, please. So I feel a bit like Chris Whitty or one of the government presenters with their next slide, please. I thought the place to start here really in terms of background and history is a bit of a back to basics question about why we bother. What's the point of a code of governance? It's always a good question to ask, isn't it? And it goes to the heart of why I suppose it's valuable for you to adopt the code of governance. So it's not that long ago, in the 1980s, when there weren't commonly codes of governance. This wasn't an accepted way of thinking about governance standards. And then the work that Sir Adrian Cadbury did in the early 1990s, looking at a corporate code of governance for the UK, got people really thinking about how you set expectations of good governance for a sector and how you develop a shared language for talking about it. And then as time went on, following on from that, there were the Nolan principles of public life developed because people recognised that those same concerns applied to the public sector and then by extension to the voluntary sector and so on, and led, for example, to the National Housing Federation developing its first code. And I often, you can really see the look of panic on people's faces when you ask them to define what governance means. It's not an easy concept to get across or understand. So codes of governance, actually, apart from anything, have some real value in helping make governance a more accessible concept. They explain what we mean when we say good governance, and they give a language that people can then use to talk about the things that make up good governance. It's probably also really important to say that codes of governance have a real value in setting baseline expectations, so minimum standards for organisations, and that matters not just for organisations themselves in order to have confidence that they're doing the very minimum they should be doing to govern well, but also actually because of the confidence that gives to stakeholders, so in our sector, to tenants, to lenders and investors, to the regulator, of course, to partners that we might work with as organisations. Codes of governance are really important in terms of giving that wider confidence. So if we move on to the next slide, the National Housing Federation published its first code in 1995. And then a little less than 10 years later than that, there was a major revision. Two main strands to that. One was introducing reference to board pay, because remuneration of board members was a relatively new consideration at that time, and also making a significant change in terms of board tenure, so introducing a maximum of 9 years for board tenure, which at the time felt very contentious and created a real stir. Obviously now we're much more used to that. And then 11 years after that, in 2015, another substantial revision. And I thought I'd just ask Steve to say a bit about that, because Steve, I think you were working at the NatFed then and oversaw the development of that code. So tell us a bit about how that felt and what changed at that point.
Yes, I was. And I joined the Federation in 2004, just when the 2004 came out. So I walked in as head of governance to the kind of huge hoo-ha around 9 years maximum. And, people started calling it, and I think that it gained a phrase called the 9-year rule, and it's never really been a rule. It's about a maximum tenure for board membership. But I think over time, people, as Kerry said, did see the benefits of it and saw the benefits of having regular term and churn on the board to keep the board refreshed and to bring in, new skills, etc., onto the board. So the big change in the 2015 code really was there was a lot more emphasis around the role of the board in leading the organisation. I think a lot of that had been driven by the failure in Cosmopolitan Housing Association, which I'm absolutely not going to go into today, but you'll probably all know a lot about it. And the regulators worry about boards not getting the right information and having the right kind of overall grip over the organisation. It reflected a number of different structural changes that were happening in organisations, where they were diversifying into different areas, setting up groups and with subsidiaries which weren't necessarily registered providers or RSLs as they were called in those days. We also changed the structure of the code to make it just more user-friendly and easy to navigate, which is always a good thing, and we built on that structure in this particular code. And I think overall it was received very well. I mean, it was adopted by a lot of people very quickly, and I think has stood the test of time. But quite rightly, this is a good opportunity to introduce a new code, as so many things have shifted in the sector and the wider environment since then. Thanks, Kerry.
Great, thanks. So if we move on to the next slide, you know, that's a bit of governance geekery in a way, isn't it, the history of the code? But I think it's helpful context to understand how we've arrived at where we are now, which is that, as Steve said, the 2015 code, and indeed the iterations before it, stood the test of time, but now felt like when we embarked on the work on the 2020 code with the National Housing Federation, I think it quickly became apparent to everybody that it was time for another major reset. And some really substantial revision both of structure and of content. I thought it might be helpful to just take you through the process a little bit. So this might be familiar to many of you, but for anyone who isn't familiar. So Steve and I, with our colleague James Tickell, have spent much of the last few months drafting this for the National Housing Federation, working closely with the National Housing Federation to agree the draft. But we've been really invaluably helped in that by the advisory group that Catherine referred to earlier, who've just really helped challenge our thinking, you know, asked really good questions, given us things to think about, and you know, the code wouldn't be the thing it is without that sort of steer and shaping from the advisory group. We were also really assisted by the 2 rounds of consultation, really comprehensive consultation, and generated an absolute wealth of comment and feedback. In fact, so great a volume of it that we had to get our research team to do a sort of sift and analysis before Steve and I could get started, because I don't think we would have known where to start. And some of the value in it, to be honest, was that it really highlighted the diversity of thinking about governance in the sector and the diverse needs of organisations, so that for every comment we had about something, almost we had someone else saying the opposite. So and obviously that's a bit of an exaggeration for effect, but there were really helpful contrasting views, lots of different opinions expressed. It made our job difficult in a way, because we had to navigate that and think about the right balance, the right line to recommend that the National Housing Federation should follow. But it really was invaluable. And then, of course, we weren't working in a vacuum either as a sector. So we looked to other sectors, we looked at wider trends in governance, we looked at what's in other codes. But we weren't simply being reactive to those things. We were also trying to look ahead and preempt what might be ahead for the sector, and to think about how the code could best equip organisations to deal with whatever those foreseen and unforeseen challenges might be. So where did that land us? Well, with a code which is differently structured from previous versions, so it's now very clearly structured around 4 principles, which Steve will talk us through shortly. Social purpose and mission, absolutely at the fore of those, in a way a sort of back to basics, a real refocusing on the core role and responsibility of the board, and in doing so a focus on the strategic role of the board, but also on how it should be proactive in delivering that role. So shaping, driving, some of the words that we might use to describe that, as opposed to being a recipient of information. And putting emphasis on the board leading by example. And you can see that particularly in the bits of the code that refer to culture and to equality, diversity and inclusion. And the implication being that the board should role model the things that it wants the organisation to be and do. And then a greater emphasis on assurance, I think throughout the code actually, that emphasis on the board obtaining and acting upon assurance on evidence. And you can quantify that actually by saying that in the 2015 code there were 2 references to assurance, both in relation to audit committees. But in this version of the code, assurance is at the heart of the 4th principle of the code, so right at headline level, and it's mentioned 9 times specifically in the code throughout the principles. So you can see there's a real change in focus there. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Steve, who's going to talk us through the 4 principles.
Thank you very much. Can we just go on to the next slide? Okay, so as Kerry said, we drafted a principle-based code. I'm not expecting any of you to read that small print, because I'll be going on to the principles in a minute. What you can see from there, from the 4 principles, is that we've tried to provide a logical flow through the code of governance, from what we're here to do to the rigorous oversight and checking. So it just gives it a bit of logic in how people actually start looking at the code and adopting it. I think the principle sets, each principle really does set the overall framework for the underlying requirements, which you'll see in the code are the from principle to practice sections. And these requirements really are explicit, and they appear under each principle. And what we did was we tried to put them in as the best fit for that principle. So although certain areas such as equality, diversity and inclusion and resident focus and workforce, they're elsewhere in the code too, but they're, to try and make sure that we've embedded those areas right the way through the code. But, for instance, in principle 1, that they're quite explicit there, but they do appear elsewhere. And the requirements, the four from principle to practice sections, they're really designed to be the ways and means which you as organisations can demonstrate compliance with each principle. The expectation very much is that any departure from the requirements is because you're doing something that's that has achieved the same or a better result. So again, it comes back to what Kerry was saying earlier around setting a baseline for organisation. So that's the thinking behind the actual the requirements underlying each of the principles. I'm now going to go on to each of the principles in turn. So can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so principle 1, mission and values. Do forgive me, I'm going to have to gallop through these because I know that we're very tight for time. So I'm not going to go through anything in any great detail. But I would like you on that first principle to just note the wording around the fact that the board sets and actively drives. We were very careful with working on the code and with the advisory group to get the wording right on this. And it's about making sure here that the board is absolutely in control of the mission of the organisation, setting it and actively driving the mission, making sure that it sets the values of the organisation. And it's very much around having the board having clarity on its role here and to be influencing and not being passive or just paying lip service to information that's provided to it. And I think more importantly, in a way, it's about aligning the organisation to its core purpose. Housing associations are charities, and it's about aligning you to the fact that you're a charity, but also, you are a business too, and that you have a social purpose. And social purpose very much is front and centre, of this code, and is quite explicit in the wording around the principles. Just looking at the new or stronger areas of emphasis. I'm going to ask Kerry in a minute to have a talk to you about the first 2 bullet points there. So I'm just going to quickly go through the last 3 around safety and compliance. This brings us back very much to the fact that the board has an employer and a landlord role as well. And it's around trying to get boards to get assurance about the safety of residents and also the wider public regarding the decisions it takes, and what evidence does it actually see, what consideration has it given to this evidence. So somewhere in the minutes there should be excuse me, a record of the considerations that it's actually had to show that it's actively taking a view on this. Organisational culture, again, assurance that the culture that the board has set aligns with its mission and values, assurance that the culture is set flows through the organisation too. So that's where that particular requirement is coming on from. And lastly, on reputation and trust, and Catherine mentioned this earlier, that it is very, very key, and it is absolutely key, which is why it's got its own separate requirement in the code. I always ask boards, when I'm talking to them, to consider, what I call the local paper test on these issues. What are the questions when you're making a decision? Are you asking yourself the question, how would this look in the local paper if it played out? What is the impact on our potential impact on our reputation, the potential impact on the reputation of the sector if this went horribly wrong? And this all comes back to the decisions that the board is making. It can be around data breaches. It could be around the publications that you have and the potential for anything that is defamatory in them. So it's around the board having real control around these areas to protect its own reputation. So I'm now going to ask Kerry just to talk about the resident focus and EDI areas which are implicit, embedded in Principle 1.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And so if we move on to the next slide, we see we've got some separate slides on these two. So, really because, well, for two reasons. One is because there is considerably more emphasis on them in the new code, and also because they attracted lots of comment and interest during the process of the consultation. So we thought it'd be worth saying something a little bit more substantial about each of them. On resident focus, I think the first thing to say is that it was clear in the consultation responses the passion, and I think it's fair to use that word, the strength of feeling in the sector towards the NatFeds Together with Tenants work, which is, you know, for anyone who isn't aware, the sector-wide initiative to strengthen the relationship between residents and their housing association landlords. And we had a wealth of responses really stressing how important that work is to the sector and how keen people were that the Code of Governance aligned with the Together with Tenants work. So we've been very careful to make sure that that's the case. The code, as had been essentially committed to when Together with Tenants was begun, makes an explicit commitment or requirement for boards to demonstrate accountability to tenants, or in the phrasing of the code, residents and other customers. But there's also a specific reference to Together with Tenants in the guidance, where the National Housing Federation is clear that it expects that that housing associations will adopt the Together with Tenants Charter as the most expedient way of meeting the requirements in the code around this. There are lots of other references in the code to the ways in which it expects boards and organisations as a whole to focus on the views and needs of residents. So there's provision for influence over strategic decision making, for scrutiny both of the work of the organisation and of the work of the board in terms of holding the board to account. There are requirements around the board having access to insight into the views and needs of its tenants, of the organisation's tenants, and in turn for regular reporting back. And I think, you know, this is some of the content that chimes really well with the white paper, and obviously we were attempting to anticipate in drafting the code what would be in that. There's also a specific requirement, not in Principle 1, which I appreciate is still what we're talking about, but actually elsewhere in the code there's a requirement which Steve made reference to earlier about people with lived experience, and obviously the phrasing of the code is such that it's referring to either people with direct lived experience themselves of the communities served by the organisation, or particular insight into those communities, perhaps because they work in the communities and work closely with those living within them. But people with that sort of experience and direct insight being involved somehow in the governance structures of the organisation. So again, this is something that's embedded throughout the code, although the principal requirements are set out under Principle 1. And then if we move on to the next slide, I'll just talk about equality, diversity and inclusion, which was another key focus in the drafting of the code. And again, we received lots of consultation responses about this, mostly and pleasingly very positive about the direction of the draft code, but also giving us very helpful pointers about more work to be done. And so the final version of the code obviously is the end result of that. Of course, that direction of travel has been influenced by what's been happening in society as a whole, and by movements such as Black Lives Matter, other movements which are, you know, powerful in terms of making the case for change and driving organisations to do more and do better. And of course, there was a desire to represent that in the code, but it also, I think, represents direction of travel also underway within the sector and more widely in society. The language of the code here, and again, Steve referred to this earlier, is very important. So there's reference to active commitments in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion that are meaningfully demonstrated. And those words are very carefully chosen, thought through. They translate into a requirement to have in place priorities and objectives, and then for the board to obtain assurance that those objectives are actually being delivered in practice, and in turn to operate openly and transparently in publishing information about that progress. There are, again, elsewhere, although the main provisions here or requirements are under Principle 1, the attempt's been made to embed this throughout the whole of the code. So there are requirements elsewhere, for example, for workforce, the board to ensure that workforce policies and practices reflect that commitment that it has made to equality, diversity and inclusion, and for the composition of the board to be diverse. So the wording of the code requires that composition of board and committees is made up of people with diverse backgrounds and attributes, having regard to the diversity of the communities the organisation serves, and in line again with the stated commitments that the organisation has made to equality, diversity and inclusion. So you can see that thread through from those commitments, which must be meaningfully demonstrated, into the various bits of the code. So I hope it was helpful to amplify those particular points, but I will now hand back to Steve, who's going to talk you through the remainder of the 4 principles. Steve, you need to unmute.
Steve, you might be on mute, Steve.
Nightmare. So we're on to principle 2, which is strategy and delivery. And again, as I mentioned before, this is around the organisation's board being active in setting the ambitions. So it's about having that active role, and then of course at the end, that effective oversight of their delivery. So all the way through the code, this is about having an active and dynamic board. It's also about the fact that you are charities, but you're also businesses, and in the long term, you need to remain financially viable and sustainable, and that the board needs to take this kind of active role in ensuring that this viability is maintained. So that's really where the overall principle is coming from. Looking at the areas of emphasis that we've either included as new or strengthened, the environmental and financial and social sustainability focus. We're in 2020 now, and environmental issues are absolutely key to ensure a sustainable business and maintain its reputation. And these issues are to be reflected really in the strategies and plans that the board sets. And I've been recently to some very small organisations which are doing this. So this isn't the preserve of really big organisations. People are taking an active role now in thinking around areas such as carbon neutrality, environmental sustainability in the round, in the decisions that they're taking, in the discussions that they're having. Working with others. This is not about merger. This is not about encouraging organisations in any way to go into merging with other organisations. It's absolutely about getting organisations, if you're not already doing so, to start considering from time to time how best the corporate strategy, how best the social purpose can be delivered, which may involve, entering into working with organisations, other organisations, collaborating with organisations in a light way or a much more formal way, having formal partnerships. It's about what's best for the business now and in the long term. So that's really the underlying theme behind that particular requirement in the code. Working with others, workforce matters. Again, this isn't about the board getting into the operational detail, and we've tried very hard when we were writing the code to ensure that we're not becoming prescriptive and certainly allowing a board to getting into the weeds of an organisation's function. This is about ensuring really that the board has sight over staff issues that may have an influence on the decision-making process, and that it's aligned to its overall culture and values, and that these practices kind of support the business success, issues around equality, diversity, and inclusion in the staff place, policies around workforce safety, and that these are regularly reviewed, and that these key policies are reviewed around workforce safety and their effectiveness, because that very much again ties in with the role of the board as employer. The area around group structures and JVs, there's far more in the code this year than there was in section H5 of the code of 2015. The main focus really on the subsidiaries are that they are there to enhance the mission of the organisation, and that they therefore need to be, reviewed from time to time to ensure that they're still fit for purpose and what you as organisations need, so that they don't get too complicated and unwieldy. And a lot of the IDA focus over the years has been looking at organisations that have just got so structurally unwieldy that there is a lack of line of sight between the main board and its subsidiaries. So it's around making sure that boards take a bit of grip on this and keeping a view on how many subsidiaries and JVs that it's setting up. There's also areas within that around the board being in control around whether any subsidiaries should or should not adopt this code. Again, it's for the board to decide what the most appropriate code or a code of governance to be adopted, is for those subsidiaries. And again, the administration, some issues around the administration of managing overlapped boards to ensure the smooth running and clarity and managing of any of the decisions and managing any conflicts of interest. Okay, I'm just going to go on to the next slide now, which is board effectiveness. For those of you here who are familiar with the 2005 code and have read this code, you'll note that there's quite a lot of the content which is broadly similar. So I'm not going to go into this into too much detail. I think for me, and again, it comes back to what Kerry was saying earlier, the key thing around the actual principle is around the wording and the inclusion of the words, skilled and diverse board. So again, it's bringing the EDI issue back up to board level, so that again, the board should be considering when looking at succession planning and recruitment for the board, that issue around having a diverse board with different viewpoints on it, and that at the same time it is still a skilled board to manage the business. The significant change really on board effectiveness is around tenure. As I mentioned earlier, there was a hoo-ha in the 2004 code around 9 years. There has been a number of comments, I would say. I don't think we can get to hoo-ha status at the moment, but there has been a number of comments around the bringing of the code into a more explicit requirement around having a maximum tenure of 6 years. It's the shift now really is now to normally 6 years. So it's in the best if it's really in the best interest of the organisation, there is that flexibility for an individual to be elected up to 9 years. So this isn't saying it's absolutely 6 years, in all cases. There is a bit of flexibility, but I think we had to make the emphasis now towards 6 years to encourage more diversity and churn on the board. I mean, it's for each organisation to decide what is in the best interests of the organisation. It may be initially around the smoothing process for succession planning, but we haven't actually stipulated a process. But you'll see from the guidance that we produce, good practice is that if for any of you who do feel the need to extend tenure up to 9 years, it's on an individual basis, and that really good practice is that you review this for each person on an annual basis. But there is that flexibility. But I think what we were very keen with this, and again, we did take on board a lot of the consultation responses and the views of the Federation as well, was that some change needed to be made here. So that's really the most significant area there. And if we can go on to the next slide, which is Principle 4. Again, coming back to what Kerry was saying earlier, we've changed the title of this particular theme from what was audit and risk now to control and assurance. And again, it's emphasising the role that the board has in exerting control over the organisation and gaining the right levels of assurance. There's far more in this particular section on risk management, and the underlying things like stress testing and risk appetite and business continuity that kind of underpin risk management as a whole. There's a lot more emphasis on control and assurance throughout, and there is now a new section on compliance with the board responsibility for complying with the legal, regulatory, constitution stuff. Again, it's putting the emphasis on the board to ensure that these areas are being complied with. It's their responsibility. And unlike the last code where a section on whistleblowing was in the guidance, this is now again front and centre in the actual code, a specific section on whistleblowing. So if I could just go into the one of the last slides now, which is a postscript about the guidance. For those of you who've actually had a look at the guidance, you'll see that it's in a very different format to the guidance that was. It's also an awful lot longer. We've produced what I hope is extremely comprehensive guidance for you. And I would like to note that it is live. So it's going to be an online resource for people to use. And that means that from time to time, as things change, and this was very much taking on board a lot of the responses we got from the consultation, things can change and things can be updated, so that it will be a continually updated set of guidance for you. It's worth noting that it's not prescriptive. This is not part of the code. It's an interpretive aid for you. And our view very much is that this should be applicable for all housing associations. Saying that, there is a section in the guidance specifically for some very small organisations who might need just a bit of support in how they can actually use the code productively for them as organisations, so that they can comply with the code without having to worry too much about having to comply with every single element of all the underlying requirements. So I think we've made some good progress there in giving some assistance to some very small, maybe non-developing organisations. And it also includes the checklist, which some of you will be familiar with, and again, hopefully that you'll find that very helpful too. So back to Kerry.
Thanks, Steve. So if we just go on to the very last slide, I'm not going to spend much time summing up because I know that you'd rather hear from Fay-Ann and also have the chance to ask some questions. So I think just to conclude that, hopefully it's clear that this is far more than a rewrite of the 2015 code. It's a thorough modernisation and reset. It does nonetheless draw on the best of what's come before, but with a new phraseology, a new focus and structure, and we hope that our presentation has really helped you understand the ways in which it's changed. Thank you, and I will hand over to Fay-Ann now.
So thank you very much, Kerry and Steve. Really appreciate that presentation. So hi, I'm Fay-Ann Simpson. So I'm a board member at L&Q, and I'm chair of the Resident Services Board, and I've been involved as a resident with L&Q for over 20 years now. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the importance of this new code and thinking about how you approaches to adopting the new code to make it work. So I've been so pleased to be in part of the advisory group, and part of shaping the new code, and I'd just like to say it was a really diverse and I think challenging process, and I think that's what got the best out of the whole process. So I think the new code of conduct, as has been said, has been created in that context of the social housing white paper that just out yesterday, and the NHS really important work together with tenants. So I think a theme running throughout all of this work is about treating residents with respect, valuing their insight and lived experience, and also the word dignity is something that's run throughout all of the initiatives in the white paper. So I think the code has been created within that context. I think the thing for me that's important is that this new code is ambitious. It's ambitious in its outlook, and it captures the key challenges facing us both now and in the future. And it's about striving as organisations to be well run, to create great services and homes for our residents, and to be fully connected to our residents. So I think this code really helps us interrogate that clarity of purpose of who we are, what we are trying to do, and to keep asking those questions. So I think resident voice and stakeholder accountability has also been, I think, greatly emphasised from the previous code. So as a sector, we're not just about bricks and mortar, we're about people. or about people at our heart. We create homes, and good governance really allows us to create those homes, those services, the safety and security of our residents. And I think it's about residents also feeling safe. So if we have a connected governance, that's about how we do that. I think, you know, the memory of Grenfell is really strong in our minds, and we're really conscious about the devastating costs of when we don't have good governance. So I think it's incumbent on us more than ever to adopt good practices, and I think this code really helps us to do that. And also, I think it's about the diversity of our organisations. So we have diverse organisations operating across the country, and we have a diversity of residents, and that's changing all the time. So I think the code, for me, really helps us to interrogate that diversity, and helps us to make sure we understand how we are best served by the diversity and the wealth of skills and talents. So I think for me that is really the real strength of the new code. So I think thinking about how we can look at adopting the new code. So I think first of all, one of the first things is to keep interrogating that clarity of purpose, keep asking what you're doing and why you're doing it, talk to residents, talk to your staff, be clear about what it is you're doing and continuing to challenge that. So I think if something doesn't fit in terms of your purpose and your vision, then you just need to stop doing it. So I think there's something to keep. It's the code. The code is a living document for you to keep referring to. And I think for me, in terms of having that accountability for your residents, I think that comes with humility. So I think we all need to accept that there is no one that has a greater stake in their homes and community than your residents. And you should also not underestimate the skills and the diversity of your residents either. So recently L&Q set up a resident services board, which is the committee of our group board, which I chair, and I was just absolutely blown away by the skills of the diversity and talent, and we should just never forget that, and we need to just keep challenging ourselves on that, about who our residents are and the skills that they have. So I think it is also accepting that our residents know about the communities within which they live, and it's because they built those communities, and it's one conversation at a time and quite painstaking. But I think if we draw on those skills and those experiences, then it makes us better organisations. And I think we also need to remember that behind every KPI there are residents. So I think, you know, thinking about Steve's point about us as board members not being just passive receptacles of information, we really need to challenge the information that we're getting, because I think I understand, as you know, organisations, big or small, we have huge amounts of information, but sometimes we don't always challenge what the information is telling us. So I think we need to be asking the right questions. We need to be also continuing to challenge ourselves on that. So I think in terms of accessibility, we need to make sure that our residents have access to information. Our residents want to be involved. They care intimately about the safety and well-being of their communities, their families. So we need to I think we need to interact with residents on their terms. So it's about us going out and asking our residents about information about their communities, and it's also asking them at the start of the process, not at the end when we've done everything. So I think it is about thinking about ways that we can reach out to diverse areas of our resident base, and our residents will help us let us know what that is. And I think, you know, residents want to be involved in the decision making, so I think accessibility and availability goes both ways. So it's about us as the board reaching out to our residents and also looking at ways that we can become more engaged with residents. So it's about bringing everything closer together. And I think I would say don't treat this new code as a tick box exercise. I think for me, it's been really important to think about this code as a living document. So one that you would continually interrogate, thinking about the things that you do, continuing to challenge your assumptions. I think it's not a document you should just put on the shelf and gather dust. I think it's something that's evolving as I think the world around us is evolving. I think we have to continue to test our assumptions about the things that we do. And I think lastly, I would say in terms of adopting the code, I think we need to continue with that spirit of collaboration, because I think there are many voices around the sector, and I think you know, expertise doesn't reside just with one area, with one person. So I think we need to work together to get the best out of the code. So I think you know, I think those are just a few reflections I have. I could say so much more, but I won't at this time because I really want to hear questions from you. So I'll just hand back to Catherine now to lead those questions.
Brilliant, thanks Fayan, and thanks so much to Steve and Kerry for running us through the code and what's in it. I have a lot of questions that have come through. So I'm going to try and get through as many as we can. So I'm going to ask the panel if you can to be brief in your responses, just to ensure that we get to as many as we can. So the first one is not a question but a comment, so we can just make this comment and move on. As predominantly a homeless organisation, I was pleased to see reference to those with real lived experience than simply tenant involvement. So really helpful to get that perspective. We have a lot of questions and comments about the 6-year tenure of board members. I'm going to read a couple of them out. Many of them are in the same vein, so I'm just going to read a couple of them out together, and then I'll ask Kerry or Steve to come in on that. So just bear with me while I read a few of these out. I've got a lot, so I'm going to have to do a bit of scrolling and reading at the same time. So stick with me. One of the comments is, we're a small housing association with a voluntary board. Use our committees to train new prospective members to retain our culture. The 6-year rule would cause us huge difficulties. There's another comment that says, if we wanted to continue one of our existing 9-year terms, we could without being in breach. That's a question. Tenure for existing board members, when should the 6 years start? There's another comment, can you explain the reasoning for recommending a tenure of 6 years? This would be a challenge for smaller organisations. And then another, what or who is driving the 6 years, especially for those of us smaller housing associations who attract good quality unpaid board members and are very much motivated by their homelessness charity status. I think that covers off most of the, or one more, in relation to the 6-year tenure. What might we say to a member approaching the 6-year point who felt they had committed to being a member for 9 years, having signed up on that basis? So Steve, do you want to come in on that one? Because I know we had quite a lot of feedback and we thought really hard about this, and I think there's a bit more in the guidance that will sort of reassure people around the change from 9 to 6 years.
Okay, please Kerry, do chip in if I'm going off beam at any stage, because we did get a lot of response back on this. I think primarily for, and I'm going to concentrate more on you know, very small organisations that do maybe find it traditionally difficult to get, you know, a lot of people wanting to come on their board. Those who have got a number of board members who have been on the board for you know, a few years and have given a really good service. I mean, I think first and foremost, you know, this is about what's best for the business. And although, you know, some organisations may well decide, some of the smaller organisations may well decide that, you know, 6 years on a board is something that they need to work towards, you know, over time, and that at present, you know, they need to have include some kind of smoothing process to enable board members to be brought in, you know, new board members to be brought in. But it may be that in the best interests of the organisation, one of the best interests of the organisation may be that you want to remain core as a board, that you need to keep people on for a bit longer. I kind of, in a way, would slightly push back on the idea that anyone should join a board with an assumption that they should be there for 9 years. I know, obviously, in reality, that may be the case. But, you know, board tenure is split into kind of terms of office. And every year, if you've got a good appraisal system going, or even an opportunity for the board member to have a conversation with the chair, you know, the question should be asked about, you know, whether you feel that you're still giving value to the board, and whether you're still offering a good insight to the board, and whether, you know, the board still is in a situation where it needs you as a board member, or whether it's time to move on and try and bring in, you know, new blood onto the board. And I know that these are difficult conversations. Kerry, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would absolutely agree with everything Steve said, but I think there's a big point as well. And someone asked the question about, you know, why this shift? And I think that's a really important one to address. And the short and simple answer to that is that this is designed to facilitate, ease that process of board renewal, which we recognise is really, really important for healthy, diverse governance. And so partly that increased speed of renewal allows organisations to speed up the process of creating more diverse boards and bringing more diverse talent onto boards. And it also eases the renewal that we know needs to happen as the strategic cycle of the organisation evolves and the needs around the board table shift. And that has tended sometimes, we know, it's tended to be difficult actually to overcome that expectation on the part of people that they're there to serve 9 years. Whereas actually, of course, they're there to serve for as long as it's in the interest of the organisation that they are there. And we think that the way the code is phrased now, with that discretion to permit 9 years where it's in the best interest of the organisation, hits that target very precisely.
Thanks, Kerry. And I think it is really important that we stress that the discretion is there. This is not a code which is designed to penalise people who have made decisions in the best interest of their residents and organisations. I'm going to move it on because I'm really conscious of time and we have so much to get through. So I'm going to keep going. Fayan, this is just a reflection, not a question for you, but a reflection on your comment. Behind every KPI, there are residents. Is perfectly expressed and should guide us all the time. So a big thumbs up for that one. Got another question about small housing associations. So with less than 100 properties, you both touched on this, Steve and Kerry, but the code is based on comply or explain. This association would wish to adopt most aspects, but there are some areas not applicable. Are we encouraging adoption for smalls as well? And have we had any feedback about the new code? Steve, I wondered if you could just touch on the guidance explicitly on that one and just provide some reassurance on that one.
Yeah. Okay, I'll be uncharacteristically brief here. Please read the guidance. I think there is a specific area in the guidance for very small organisations, which hopefully will help you, dear small organisation, to give you the assurance that you can comply with the code. Certainly, it will be about looking to see the bigger picture, as Fayan was alluding to earlier. Look at the big picture of what the code is trying to get you to do. Look at how you can adopt each of the principles, which I see no reason why you couldn't. Use the underlying requirements to give you as a guide, and think about, if you can't, you know, if it's too onerous, what else can you do to ensure that you overall can comply with those principles. There'll also be some areas in the code that may simply be not applicable for you.
Great, thanks, Steve, and appreciate the brevity on that one. There's a question here about the sibling document, the code of conduct, still being live and relevant. I'm going to take this one to save anyone else answering this one. Yes, we will. The current code of conduct is still live and relevant, but we will be looking at whether it's appropriate to review that in the new year. So please do look out for that. And then I think quite a simple question, Kerry, I'll put this one to you first, but happy to step in as well. Did we have any input from the regulator, and have we had any reaction from them about it?
Yes, we certainly had input from the regulator, so we were very careful to ensure that we did have in the process. And Catherine, you might want to say whether we've had any reaction.
No specific reaction from the regulator, but I think, as you say, Kerry, really constructive input from them, and we will be talking to them about it in our regular meetings with them. And also, I do think we've had quite a lot of questions that have come through about the new social housing white paper and perhaps the change in emphasis on the work of the regulator. And I do see very much the new code and the new direction of the code, particularly around resident focus and around issues around accountability to residents, but it is very much pushing in the same direction as the social housing white paper and the work of the regulator around consumer regulation. So we will keep talking to them about it, but we had really good input from them through the course of the development of the code.
It was also
got a question
very,
here about
Catherine, about making sure that the code was fit for purpose for a number of years. So, you know, we were thinking very much about the implications of the white paper in this.
There's a question here about 3 or 4 years ago, the zeitgeist was very much professionalisation of boards and moving away from resident board members. Is that now changing? Fayan, do you want to offer some reflections on that one?
Okay, well, I would very much challenge whether you know, residents on boards moves us away from the professionalisation from boards. I would definitely say not. So I don't think that's the case at all. I think you know, our resident base is growing and more diverse than ever. And you know, just speaking of a organisation such as L&Q, I think, you know, whatever you're looking for within your resident base, we can find it. And I think so I think, again, it is just reflecting on the skills that it exists within the resident base, that I think, you know, the breadth and depth is huge. So I would say no, that's not moving away from that.
Thanks, Fayan. I've got another question here for you. How do you encourage other board members to be engaged and accountable to residents and thread that through to board actions? Do you have any sort of advice or reflections on that one? And I think this again speaks to very much the sort of thrust of yesterday's white paper, doesn't it?
I would say, I think what I've done over many years is really try to broaden as much as possible my experiences of interacting with residents. So I think getting out and about, speaking to residents, I think making yourself more open and visible, and I think it's about challenging and asking those questions. So I think I'm someone who's of a very sort of curious nature, so I would encourage board members to really challenge the experiences they're being exposed to in terms of that visibility of all their residents. So I think it's for us to push as much as bringing residents to us, I think. So
I've got a comment on that one, Fayan, from someone in the audience that says, to echo Fayan's comments in relation to professionals being on board, L&Q is significantly stronger and more versatile for having Fayan on the board. So just to back up your comments there. I'm conscious of time. There is an awful lot of questions that we didn't get through. I've got one comment here that just to sort of reflect on that 6-year point further. Two Saints is a relatively small housing association that is also a homelessness charity. We have no problems recruiting good quality board members, and I think the code's reference to terms of tenure is spot on. I think just wanted to read that out just to illustrate the point that there isn't one way of doing this, and there's not one reaction from the sector that everybody is going to have in common. I am going to have to draw it to a close. I am enormously grateful to our fantastic speakers. I'm so sorry if we didn't get to your questions. I would urge you to read the code, and I think more importantly, perhaps, is have a read of the guidance. I think many of your questions will be answered in the guidance, particularly around how you might adopt it, any tips for adoption, what some of the kind of specific terms in the code mean. So please do have a proper read of the guidance. You can get in touch with the Federation if you have any particular questions that you want answered about how the code applies to you and your circumstances. So thank you for all those enormously constructive questions. Again, I apologise if we didn't get to yours. Massive thank you to our speakers. Thank you to everybody for joining today. Enormously great participation. I am going to have to draw it to a close now. We will send everyone an email in the next week or so, which will include a link to the recording of the webinar and the slides. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot from it. We'd really appreciate it as you leave if you could answer this quick poll, which has popped up on your screen now. All other upcoming webinars are listed at housing.org.uk/events. We've got our Board Excellence Virtual Conference in January and also a specific webinar coming up on the white paper next week, and then one in the future with the regulator and MHCLG. So do join those. Thanks very much for listening. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.